Good morning and welcome to another online Awaken sermon. This one back at the kitchen table because it was snowing outside this morning and it's just way too cold to be out there on the patio today. Now, today what I want to do is I want to start a new conversation. And the title of this sermon is What Makes Us Human? And what I want to explore together over the next couple of weeks is what does it mean to be human? And I want to look at some of the stories, some of the narratives that have been shaping our lives up until this point. All of our lives are being shaped by narratives and stories, some that we're aware of and others that are simply lying under the surface. And one of the things that this coronavirus pandemic is doing right now is it's bringing some of the things that were under the surface, it's bringing them up to the surface. And we're being given an opportunity right now to evaluate all the stories that have been shaping and guiding and directing our lives. And so the invitation of the moment is to look at all those stories and then ask, well, what stories are serving us well? What stories are leading us down the path of discovering our truest selves, our truest humanity? What stories are helping us live fully human? And what stories are actually taking us away from that pursuit? What stories are actually robbing us of our humanity? They're dehumanizing us and those around us. And see, one of the things about this moment is this could be a missed opportunity if we don't take the time to sift through and evaluate all the stories. If we were to just return to life as normal, whenever that happens to be, if that's at all possible, without evaluating that which has risen to the surface during this time. Because we're seeing all sorts of systems and structures that they're not serving all of us well. And they're now being exposed for what they are, dysfunctional. And all those systems, all those structures, they're simply a product of the stories and the narratives that we are collectively telling ourselves. And if we don't take the time to evaluate those stories, to look at which ones are good and helpful and true versus the ones that are actually destructive and harmful, if we don't stop and ask ourselves these questions, well, then we'll just keep on going down the same path that we've been walking. And maybe you're like me and you've come to realize that some of these stories, they're really bad for us. And in actuality, they're taking us away from the path that God desires to lead us down. And so that's the invitation of the moment, to sift through these stories. What do we leave behind? And what do we need to embrace? What are the new ways forward that we need to embrace together? And this conversation, it's not a new conversation. It's not a modern day conversation. It's actually an ancient conversation. It's a conversation that humans have been having for a really, really long time, for thousands and thousands of years. And one of the places where I see this conversation taking place, it's right in the Bible. Now, I understand for some of us, the view that we've been handed of the Bible is the Bible contains a whole bunch of rules of things to do or not to do, or it contains a whole bunch of true statements, things to either believe or reject. But the Bible is so much bigger than that. The Bible, it's a story. It's a conversation that we're being invited to participate in. And at the heart of the Bible is this conversation about what does it mean to be human? How do we live as the people that we've been created to be? How do we live as our truest selves? How do we live as fully human individuals? How do we walk the path of the true? All the questions we're asking today, they're questions that people have been asking for thousands and thousands of years. These are not new questions. And what we come to discover in the Bible is that so often we get off track and we, as humanity, we start walking down a path that takes us away from that which is most true about ourselves. And God is constantly reminding and steering and pushing and guiding and trying to move us down the path that is the most true to who we really are. God is trying to move us down this divine path. See, at the heart of the Christian faith is this belief that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. For many of us, we focus so much of our time and our attention on the divinity of Jesus. We sing songs about this every Sunday morning. Sermons are preached about this very often. But we very rarely, if at all, talk about the full humanity of Jesus. We're okay, we're good with the divinity part, but talking about the full humanity of Jesus, that's a conversation that we don't too often reflect on. We're okay with trusting that Jesus reveals the true picture of who God is, but Jesus revealing to us the full picture of what true humanity looks like, Jesus being a model for us in our own path, our own pursuit of that which is true, yeah, that's one that we don't often reflect on. But all throughout the Gospels, the stories about the life of Jesus, Jesus is constantly inviting people, follow me, follow me, follow me. You'll hear this time and time again. And I believe this was an invitation for his disciples 2,000 years ago, but it's also an invitation for us today. Essentially, what Jesus is saying when he's saying, follow me, he's saying, if you want to walk the path that is true, if you want to discover what's most true about you, if you want to come to experience the depth and the richness that you already have birthed within you, then model your life on my life. Model your life on how I'm living my life, on how I'm setting my life up, on my teachings. If you want to discover the divine life, if you want to discover a life of meaning and satisfaction and fulfillment because you're deeply, deeply connected to the person you've been created to be, then follow me down this path. In the Bible, it's the story of people who have been stumbling onto that path. People who they're walking with others, discovering what this path looks like for themselves. And as they stumble along, they come to find a life that is deeply, deeply connected to life itself. They're finding a life that is connected to their life. They're finding a life that's connected to the lives of others around them. They're finding a life that is deeply connected to this beautiful creation that we find ourselves immersed in. They're finding a life that is connected to the divine life that created and sustains all things. See, the path of Jesus, when Jesus says, follow me, the path of being a follower of Jesus, of being a Christian, it's the path of discovering who you've always been. It's a path of uncovering your truest self. And that's the journey. That's the conversation that we see all throughout the pages of the Bible. And that's the conversation that for us today, we're being invited to participate in. So for these next few weeks, well, those are some of the questions that I want to ask. What does it look like to walk this path? What does it mean to be fully human? What does it mean to be fully alive? And are there certain stories that aren't serving us well and we need to leave those behind? And then are there some new stories to pick up and to start walking, to start allowing to shape our lives in really intentional ways? So let's start by talking about one particular narrative that I've seen start to arise during this time. And I believe it's always been there, But again, whenever you have a disruption, whenever you're in the midst of chaos, it's almost as if all the stuff that's been lying there under the surface, it now gets dragged up. And it's much easier to see in these times of disruption. So the first story, I would say, is the belief that your value, your worth, your very humanity is based on how much or how quickly you can produce. Maybe you can relate to this one. So a couple of weeks back, when the stay-at-home order first went out, when we weren't able to go out and congregate, we weren't able to go to our offices, we were supposed to stay at home as much as we possibly could. We had to work from home. Kids couldn't go to school, couldn't go to preschool. All the normal routines were being disrupted, and we had to shelter in place, stay at home. I started to see a whole bunch of emails and social media posts and news stories where people were giving advice about how to maximize your production in the midst of quarantine. Some of the articles, instead of just simply maximizing your production, they were talking about how to make this time even more productive than normal time. So if you do these 6 things, if you do these 7 things, then when quarantine ends, you'll have this massive output. You'll have produced so much more work than what you were used to producing, or at least your production won't begin to decline. And I remember seeing these stories, and my anxiety level started to increase a bit. And I started thinking, all right, I can do this. I can maximize my output. I can maximize my production. Maybe I can even do more. There's a few side projects that I was working on. Yeah, maybe I can bust those out in half the time that I was expecting. But there is also this tension within me of, but it's going to be a lot more difficult to work from home. It's going to be a lot more difficult when I can constantly hear my young children running around or screaming upstairs because they don't want to go down for a nap or because they need a diaper change. So there was all this background noise. So I had this tension of maximize, do more, keep going versus, but hold on a second. We're in the midst of a pandemic and life's not normal right now. And there's some things that are really, really being disrupted and that could cause actually less production than normal. And first off, let me just say this. The fact that we can even have a conversation about maximizing our production, that's a privilege. That's a privilege. And we need to understand that not everyone has that luxury. Not everyone is able to, as we said over the past couple of weeks, not everyone can work from home. There's some of you who are watching this now and many others who are essential workers, and you have to go out and work every single day. You have to be out there on the front line. So maximizing your production from the safety of your home, it's not a luxury that you have. So let's first acknowledge that conversation in itself, it's a privilege. It's a privilege, and not everyone has that privilege. And then second, what I've come to realize over the past couple of weeks is maximizing production or doing more. Well, it's not taking into account the psychological or the mental toll that quarantining or staying in place is having on us. Because you can't necessarily be your best self in the midst of all we're going through. There's a certain level of trauma that we're all experiencing. And we need to admit that reality. We need to be honest with it. But the narrative that I was hearing right from the beginning, and I still see it. I actually saw one celebrity said that you should use this time to learn a new language. Great. I don't have that time. Not going to happen for me. But the more you hear this, the more this story, this narrative is put in front of you, the greater the anxiety level could potentially be. Because if the story that you've been allowing to shape your life has been your worth, your value is in how much you produce, well, if your production were to decrease, Well, now that's going to affect what you believe about yourself. Maybe it might affect how others view you or the value that you believe you offer to others. See, this is a story that we are indoctrinated into at a very, very young age. I have here one of Reese's favorite books, Thomas the Tank Engine, Hidden Surprises. This is a book that we've been reading to Reese now for, I'd say, over a year. He's almost 3, so we started when he was about 2 years old. Here's the first line. Thomas is a really useful engine. You hear that? Let me read it again. Thomas is a really useful engine. First line in the book, when you open it up, Thomas is a useful engine. Why? Well, because of the value that he offers. I remember coming across this idea a couple of years ago. Kurt, who you all know, he did an interview with me last week. He talked about this in a sermon that he gave at Awaken about 5 or 6 years ago, about how from a young age we're telling kids, we're teaching them that their value, their worth is in the fact that they can be useful. So their value is dependent on how useful they happen to be. And I remember hearing that, and both Steph and myself, that made a deep impact on us. And we still talk about that idea. I mean, we think about it every single time we read this book to Reese, that we're teaching our kids, whether we realize it or not, because so much of this, it's subconscious. It's lying under the surface. We don't even realize how we're being shaped unless we actually stop and reflect and think about it. But we're being shaped by this. Thomas is a really useful engine. Dictionary definition of useful: able to be used for a practical purpose. Yeah. Why does Thomas have value, worth? Because he can be used for a practical purpose. Anyone else, you feel the same way? Your value, your worth is in the practical purposes that you can be used for. Yeah, I mean, for so many of us, this is a story that we're born into. It's the story that shapes us. And so when we go through a season, a certain time in life when we might not be producing as much, or we're not as efficient as we think we should be, we're now being haunted by this fear of, well, is my worth, is my value the same? Because for a lot of us, worth, value, and production, well, they go hand in hand. They're synonymous with each other. So how much you produce, well, that's going to depend how worthy or valuable you are. I came across this quote in a book, Art and Fear, just this past week. And here's what the authors say. Some artists identify so closely with their own work that were they to cease producing, they fear they would be nothing, that they would cease existing. Now, we're all artists to a certain extent. We all have our work. We all have our own individual lives that we're creating. That in itself is a work of art. And just like what these authors are saying, when our work is so caught up in who we are, that if we were to not be producing work, if we were to stop going, to stop doing, if we were to simply be for a moment, not producing, no output, not getting things done, it's almost as if we would cease to exist. I mean, that's a haunting fear. Is this the reason why we have trouble stopping? Is this the reason why we have trouble not checking our work email when we go home at night? Is this the reason why, for so many people, we can't take a vacation? And we brag about not having had a vacation in years. Because if we were to stop going, if we weren't producing, where would our worth and value come from? Thomas is a really useful engine. How many of us have been shaped by that story? Worth, value, rooted in how much or how quickly we can produce or get something done. Now, I need to show you two passages in the Bible that show, one that shows a harmful way in which we set our lives around this narrative, and then one better truth, one better story, one truth about how we can begin to shift how we view our value and worth. So let's start with one of the harmful stories, Exodus chapter 5. Early on in the story of the Bible, the Israelites are enslaved by the Egyptians. And two leaders rise up, Moses and Aaron. And Moses and Aaron, they go to the Pharaoh and they beg him, basically demand that he let the Israelites go. So that they can go and worship God, so they can have a 3-day festival of thanking God, thanking their God, and being grateful for all that God has done for them. So we'll pick up the story here, where they're begging, imploring, asking Pharaoh to let them go, just simply for 3 days at this point. Chapter 5, verse 1. So Moses, Aaron, they went to Pharaoh, and they said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the desert." Yes, this is the first Burning Man festival. This is where it comes from. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." And then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword." That escalated pretty quickly. But the king of Egypt said, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." And then Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working." For Pharaoh, what's it all about? Production. He was using slave labor in order to build Egyptian cities. He was viewing the Israelites as commodities, as products in themselves. The only worth, the only value that they had was in how much they could produce for him. So they can't stop working. They can't stop going. I mean, this is such a dehumanizing way of viewing others. And it continues, verse 6. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and foremen in charge of the people. "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before." The same number. Have them do more work and make sure that their production stays the same. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out. Verse 9, "Make the work harder for the men so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies." Now, if you know how this story works out, you know in the end, God wins. In the end, God rescues and sets the Israelites free from the Egyptians. But the larger conversation that's going on here is the conversation that we're asking, the question that we're asking: what does it mean to be human? Does being human mean keep going, keep producing, keep making brick after brick after brick? Or is being human about something other than simply the work that you produce? See, for Pharaoh, it was all about work, production, bricks. But what we see here right in the beginning of the biblical story is that to God, being human is about something completely different. It's not simply about your work. It's about the inherent worth and value and dignity of every single individual. It's about pausing, stopping. It's about being. So what we see early on in the story is that God is shaping the human narrative in a much different direction than what those in power are saying. I came across this article actually just last night, and it's about a meat packaging plant and how they are finally going to stop production right now because many of their workers have gotten sick. And this one news company, they interviewed a couple of the workers about what had been happening at the plant, how they were viewing things, and what they saw as a result of now this packaging facility stopping production. And here's what one of the employees says about the owners, about management. I don't think this company gives two you-know-what about their employees. I really don't. All they talked about was production, 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 production. That's all they talked about. It's the same story as what we just read in Exodus. What, according to this employee, what does management care about? Production, production, production. What does the Pharaoh care about? Production, production, production. We don't care about human life. We don't care about the consequences of what keep going and going and going, what that will do to others. All we care about is our bottom line. We care about money in our pockets and having our production stay the same. Yeah, this is a story that has been repeated again and again, and it's coming up today. How are we treating ourselves and how are we treating each other? Are we viewing others as commodities, as means to an end, or are we valuing all human life? The story that the Bible tells, the vision that God has for humanity is very different than one of production, production, production. It's one of valuing all human life. And any system, any structure that devalues, that dehumanizes, that makes humanity worth and value all about production and usefulness is a story that goes in direct contrast to the divine story that is being told over your life. God has been shaping this creation in a very particular way. And that's the direction that is most true. That's the direction that will bring the most life for ourselves and for everyone. And we need to be reminded of that story today. If we go a little further in the story of the Bible, if we turn to the New Testament, Matthew chapter 3, here we find ourselves at the beginning of the public life of Jesus. We're right at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus when he goes healing and teaching. And before Jesus does anything, he goes and he gets baptized in the Jordan by John. And so here's John, chapter 3, verse 11. John speaking to Jesus. I baptize you with water for repentance. Verse 16. We're going to pick it up in 16. So as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. And at that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased." Up until this point in the story, what has Jesus done? He was born. How much of a role did he have in that? The Gospels don't give us any backstory on Jesus before this. There's very few details about the life of Jesus that are given before his baptism. See, up until this point, Jesus hasn't taught anything. We don't know about any miracles that he's performed. He hasn't really done much. He's not a public figure. And yet, when he's baptized, before he goes and does anything, before he starts talking about the love of God, here we have God speaking over him. This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Why did God love him? Why was God announcing his love? Why was God pleased with Jesus? Not because he was useful, but because he was God's son. Because he was him. Because he was a living, breathing human. I mean, anyone else, you need to hear that story spoken over you this morning. You're loved. You are a son, you are a daughter who is loved by the divine. You're a son, you're a daughter with whom God is pleased. Not because of what you've done or what you haven't done, or not because of what you can produce, of how you can be useful for God or for anyone else, but simply because you're breathing, because you're you, because you're alive, because you're a human. At the heart of being human, it means you're loved. And divine pleasure is upon you. See, this is the biblical story. This is the story the Bible again and again pronounces over us. You are loved, and divine pleasure is upon you. This is the story that we are being invited to shape our lives and to shape what we believe about ourselves and what we believe about others. I picked these two daffodils from one of the flower beds in our front yard. We have dozens of daffodils that come up this time of year. The sad part is they're already starting to die. 3-4 weeks, that's all we have with the daffodils. One of the things I love about spring is looking at that front flower bed and seeing the dozens of daffodils that are in bloom right now. If I'm right over there at the kitchen sink doing the dishes, I have a window right in front of me. I look out and I see the daffodils. If I'm driving around the corner to come back home, which I don't do much of these days, but whenever I do, or whenever I used to, I absolutely love looking at that flower bed this time of year. Because I love seeing the flowers that are in bloom, the different colors, the different designs. Why do we love flowers so much? It's not because they're useful. It's not because of what they do. See, the truth about a flower is a flower simply is. With a flower, there's no striving. There's no anxiety trying to produce or be more. There's no trying to maximize their productivity. A flower is beautiful simply because it exists, because it is. We enjoy flowers simply because they are, because they're there, and they're simply being themselves, not trying to do more, not trying to prove anything to anyone. We love flowers simply because they exist. One of the first pieces of parenting advice that was given to me before even Reese was born was the first thing that you must do is you must enjoy your kids. Before anything else, you must enjoy your kids. It wasn't enjoy them because they're useful, because eventually they'll be able to help you do chores around the house and do the weeding. No, it was enjoy them because they're yours, because they're there, because they're alive, because they're them. Enjoy them for who they are, not for what they do. Yeah, that's the story. That's the biblical story that we're being invited into. That's the story we're being invited to trust, to believe, to allow to shape our lives. See, when you come to see the inherent value and the worth and the love that you possess before you've done anything, despite what you haven't done, and it changes your life, changes you, changes how you see yourself, changes how you see others. See, I understand that work, it's important, and we all have our role to play. We all have our work to do in the world. And this time is showing us that we need all of us. We need all of us to do the work that we were created to do. What I'm coming to realize is that the proper flow, the proper relationship is allowing work to flow out of your being. It's allowing work to flow out of the inherent value, worth, and love that you already possess. The work that I do is I give sermons each week. And I can tell if I am looking to my sermon to give me something. So if I'm trying to get something out of my sermon, if I'm trying to get acceptance, approval, if I'm trying to impress others through my sermon, I feel it. I can feel it. Something doesn't feel right within me because I'm looking to my work for worth and value. But when my sermon is flowing out of my being, out of who I am, I feel that too. And that feels true. See, I can tell the difference between the two, and the way in which I feel most alive is when my work flows out of my being. It flows out of the worth and the value and the love that I already see within myself. So your work, it's important. Production, yeah, it's important. We all need it. We all need you to produce and to do your work. We need you to be you. But the proper relationship is allowing your work to flow out of the worth and the value that you already possess. That's the story we're being invited to trust. And believing that story, it'll change your life. Trusting that story, that changes things. And you have more love for yourself. You have more love for others. Your worth, your value, it doesn't fluctuate because you're rooted in the truth that your value, your worth, it's already been determined. And there's no more love that you could possibly try to achieve because it's already yours. It's already yours. So my prayer for you this week is that you would trust that story. That you would see the immense value, the worth, the divine pleasure that is upon you. That the words spoken over Jesus before he began his ministry, before he did his work, this is my son, this is my daughter whom I love. May you hear those words. May they penetrate your soul this morning. May you see the divine pleasure that is upon you. May that change your life. May that be the story that you center your life on. And if in any way you're worried about a lack of production, or you're feeling a bit anxious because you're not producing as much as them or him or her, may you breathe out, relax, and take some time for yourself to simply be. May you simply be this week and realize your worth, your value. It's not because you're useful. It's not because of what you can produce for others, but it's because you're alive and you're you. So may that truth change your life. Grace and peace to you this week.